And can I mention one thing? You might want to push that can.
The date is December 21st, 2007.
20th.
What? Pardon me?
20th.
Oh, today's the 20th. Start over. Today is December 20th, 2007. I'm interviewing Pete Wernick of 7930 Oxford Road in Niwot. Pete, when and where were you born?
New York City, February 25th, 1946.
Do you have any brothers and sisters?
My one and only sister just passed away about a month ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
She was my older sister. Her name was Sarah, and she lived in Boston.
Was she a musician?
Not at all, no. She was a writer and collaborated on various books, including medical books.
Were there any instruments in your family at all?
My dad always had an interest in music, and from his childhood he played harmonica by ear, and that was the one instrument he would take out at gatherings and so on, and played on a pretty rudimentary level, but he always liked it, and he was interested in music, and he would acquire instruments. So as I was growing up, I was aware that there was a banjo in the house, there was also a guitar, there was also bongo drums, there was a violin, there was an accordion. They were all cheap instruments that my dad had accumulated at auctions and things like that. And when I developed an interest in the banjo, I remembered there was a banjo in the house, and that was what I started playing on, was this banjo made in the late 1800s that had been slightly refurbished after he had acquired it. And that's what I started on.
I'm going to hand you this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
This is the instrument that you play today.
Well, it's an instrument. This is a very rudimentary. It's like a beginner instrument. It's not. It's a lot closer to what I started with than what I play as my main instrument today. It's a very simple. The early banjos were gourds. Chopped in half, and then like a cat skin or something sort of attached onto it like a drum, and then with the addition of a neck and the strings, you'd have a stringed instrument. And then in the 1800s, they figured out they could make, this kind of hooped arrangement here, and so that's the way banjos have been made for 150 or more years. Mine is like this, but it also has lots of other features, including, excuse me, a piece of bell brass laid in here called a tone ring, which makes it louder and brighter, and then a whole additional piece on the back called a resonator, which makes a bigger, louder sound. And before the days of amplification, those were important developments, because a banjo had to be loud to keep up with, say, sounds of brass instruments in a marching band or something like that. And the loudness factor is less necessary now because you can be heard with microphones, but the tonal character that those changes made are part of what the bluegrass banjo sound is all about now. But I have this in the living room because it's quiet. You could do this when somebody's even napping or on the phone. When I'm practicing with my full out way of practicing, you couldn't do anything else in the same room while I'm there, which is what caused me to build a practice cabin over 100 yards from the house. And even then, my wife sometimes she says she can hear me practicing. Even when I'm facing away from the house, inside the cabin, it still makes plenty of sound.
Mm-hmm. Who makes this instrument versus who makes the one?
This is called a Good Time Banjo. It's probably the most popular starting banjo now being made. It's made in California by the Deering Company, and the one I play for my main instrument is made by Gibson. The Gibson Master Tone is sort of the standard top-of-the-line model that a lot of pros use, and I've had the one that I've been playing since 1988. And then I had a similar one that was an older one made in the 30s that I played for over 20 years prior to that, mm-hmm. Also a Gibson Master Tone.
Mm-hmm. How old were you when you really got into playing the banjo?
Well, I had a little bit of interest and actually a couple of banjo lessons when I was something like 12. But the guy I wasn't that interested in taking the lessons, and that only didn't take me very far, and I discontinued it. But when I was 14 and a half or so, I was in a period of my life where I had friends there in the Bronx where I was growing up who were into folk music and would sing and play folk songs just around the house at parties and whatnot. And one of those friends offered to show me a few phrases on the banjo. He says, you like banjo, you want to learn how to play something? So he showed me that, and then I went home and got out my dad's old banjo and started practicing on it. And it fit right into my social need structure at the time. It was a way of getting attention and fitting in, and I liked it besides. And I immediately got a big head of steam for practicing, and I made a decision which I've heard tell other people making a similar decision, which is if I practice enough on this thing, people are going to have to pay attention. If I get good enough, they'll just have to pay attention. And I thought, I can do that, and I did. And at the time, there was an instruction book by Pete Seeger that a lot of people use, but it had its limitations. It did not show anything useful about how to play the three-finger bluegrass style that was played by Earl Scruggs, which is the kind of banjo playing that turned me on the most. And my sister got me for my 15th birthday a couple of records of Scruggs, the Flattened Scruggs band, and then I had examples of exactly what I wanted to sound like in the house, and the only trouble was not have anybody show me how to make that happen. So using the rudiments that I was already learning from my friends about just how to follow chord changes, I was able to at least piece together a few elements and figure out ways of somewhat duplicating the sounds I was hearing. And with a great deal of commitment and extended effort, I got closer and closer. And by the time I was graduating high school, and I graduated pretty young, I was just past my 16th birthday when I graduated high school, but for my high school graduation, I combined money that I had with money of my parents and was able to get my first Gibson Mastertone banjo. And so at the age of 16, I was kind of launched at that point, and I was getting good enough to where I could play with other people and perform a little bit. And in New York City, one might think there's no, why would any, how do you get started as a banjo player in New York City? But it's such a big city that anything you're interested in, there'll be some other people interested in that. And if it's 1 in a million, well, then in the New York metropolitan area, that's 16 million people. And that's about actually the number of very committed bluegrass people there were in the New York area. And I was able to find them. There was a collecting point, sort of. There's a park in Lower Manhattan called Washington Square Park. And had just started a tradition of people getting together to jam, play informally on Sunday afternoons. And I would go down there in the subway with my banjo, and I would meet people, and some of them I'm still friends with, the people that I met down there, and there's some really good musicians, and they were part of my motivation to play. And I went to college in Manhattan. I went to Columbia College, and there were some musicians of different types that I met around there, and got into trying to find other people to play bluegrass with. And by the time I was a little bit into college, I had a little bluegrass band, and then I got to do a bluegrass radio program on my college FM radio station. And I had the only bluegrass radio program in New York City during the 1960s. I had 1 hour, and then became a 2-hour show called Bluegrass Breakdown, heard on Saturday mornings. And my listener area included the entire New York City area. So there's still people I run into who say they remember hearing me as a DJ in college. And that was a major part of my education, because I was able to acquire records to play on my show. And I also got access to the famous stars of bluegrass. If you asked them for an interview and they knew you were a DJ, they would be happy to agree to an interview. So when I was 18 and 19 and 20 years old, I got to interview some of the most famous bluegrass musicians of the day.
Including who?
Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass. I did an entire hour-long program with him, interviewing him and his side musicians. In the previous year, 1965, when I was 19, I went down to Roanoke, Virginia, where Fincastle, Virginia, to be exact, where the very first Bluegrass Festival ever was held, 1965. And at that festival, I interviewed Don Reno, and that interview can still be heard. You can go to YouTube and hear my interview with Don Reno. It's not a video interview, but it's on there. And Jimmy Martin, and one of the top singers of all time of bluegrass, and another person a very important figure in bluegrass who died the following year. And so I have one of the few recorded interviews with him, Carter Stanley, who's the brother of Ralph Stanley, who's still around, and they were the Stanley brothers, and he was the lead singer and songwriter for the Stanley brothers. And so my own oral history collection of bluegrass is pretty rich, and at some point I'll be arranging with the Bluegrass Museum in Kentucky to have them get copies of all that stuff.
Was Earl Scruggs still around when you were doing
Earl Scruggs is still around now, and at the time he was sort of divorced a little bit from the bluegrass scene. There were sort of feuds going on, and Flatt and Scruggs were sort of kind of above the rest of the bluegrass scene, which was in kind of bad financial straits and not doing so well. But Flatt and Scruggs were a big hit as a folk group, and they're playing a lot on the college circuit. I was there in 1962 when they filled Carnegie Hall and made a famous live record at Carnegie Hall. And they went to Japan, and they did the Beverly Hillbillies theme, and they were very, very popular. And they were not invited to any of the first bluegrass festivals because they were at odds with Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, who was the central figure.
Could I ask you to just kind of work through your initial courting?
Sure, yeah. I do this once in a while because it's part of it. It's interesting for people who don't know about bluegrass and banjo styles, and it also works in an instructional way because there's a long way from how you start on the banjo to where you sound like Earl Scruggs. And the very first thing you do is you learn chords, and the banjo is tuned to an open chord, so that's a G chord. Easiest could be. Second chord, 2 fingers, and I now have a list of over 60 songs that can be just played with 2 chords. Pretty famous songs, Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. There's a whole bunch of pretty well-known songs that just use 2 chords. And then when you have 3 chords, most bluegrass songs only have 3 chords. They're not always done in the key of G, but you can choose to do them in the key of G, and then you can sing the entire bluegrass repertoire, or 80% of it, using nothing more than that much technique. So there's a very, very low to the ground rung of the ladder that it makes this instrument accessible to everybody. But the thing that makes people want to play it is not hearing somebody go like this, but because they're hearing something fancier. Now, I don't have my gear here. My finger picks are,
well, you better put those.
Well, if you want to go get the finger picks.
I'd be glad to. Would you like to hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. The basic style that people hear that makes them interested in the banjo, and it's had a lot to do with the banjo's popularity in the last 50 or 60 years, is the 3-finger picking style of Earl Scruggs. And when you put on these finger picks, metal picks and plastic thumb pick, you get a lot stronger sound than when you use just the bare fingers. And with the different kind of banjo that I've talked about, that's another couple of quantum leaps in the same direction. But, for instance, Earl Scruggs' most popular tune is Foggy Mountain Breakdown. So, and then his other very, very, very famous piece. So that style is called Scruggs style, 3-finger picking, and it's pretty much a necessary component of what's called bluegrass music. If there's going to be bluegrass music, it should include a banjo, and the banjo would be played in this style. So when I learned how to play this style of banjo, the thing to do is to look for other bluegrass musicians to play with, and to break down how it works is, once you've learned how to make chords with your left hand, you can learn some simple roll patterns. They're called roll patterns. So here's a 4-note pattern. Just 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4. You learn how to do it faster, and then combine it with something of the left hand. So if you keep things going with your left hand, and there's a lot more than just one pattern, you have to learn how to manage a number of patterns and keep the rhythm going the whole time. Are you? Anyway, when you manage those different patterns, you have to learn a lot of what happens in the right hand has to go into the unconscious brain, kind of the way a person learns language. You can't be thinking about every single part of speech and concocting things. You have to learn some fluency to be able to play. So it's a long process. It's not a simple process. It's not a question of just learning how to read off a printed page the way a violist or an oboe player would or something. You actually have to learn how to speak a language and be able to intuit various things and have a lot of stuff happen that you're not even aware of what you're doing. For instance, the way you don't know what your mouth is doing as you're saying words. You don't know what it's doing, but it's doing it. Same thing with your right hand when you play banjo. So it's quite a long hill to climb, and it was a big deal in my life when I, first of all, realized that I could do it, and I was one of the few people around in New York City who could do it, or anywhere really. But all the professional players there were people who had gone through the same process, because Earl Scruggs had no idea how to show anybody what he was doing, doesn't know how to describe what he does. And the people who learned the same way I did, from listening to records and experimenting. I had, this jumping ahead in my bio, but in 1973, somebody gave me the idea to do a banjo instruction book to a major music publisher, which I did. And they accepted my proposal, and I wrote this book, and the book was the first book to ever come along that explained how I, at least as much as could be explained, about how to teach yourself this style. So the book became quite a big seller, and that's what opened up the door in a big way to me having a music career, is that I was making enough money from the instructional book to create some open space in my life. And that's, like I say, I'm getting ahead in my bio, but that's what allowed me to move to Colorado. It was on the heels of that book's success, and to try a career in music, even though I had already set myself up for a career in academia by that time.
Oh, what were you?
I have a doctorate in sociology, and I earned a doctorate in sociology. I received it the same year that I wrote the instruction book, and within a couple of years I had left the sociology scene behind. I was a sociologist at Cornell.
So when did you move to Colorado?
We moved here in '76, when I was 30 years old.
Mm-hmm. And you had met Joan by that time?
Yeah, Joan and I met the summer when I was 23 years old in 1969. I had a break from my studies. I'd just passed my oral examinations for my doctorate, and I had several months off. And I had only recently learned to drive, because in New York City, teenagers don't make a point of learning how to drive because you don't have a car anyway. But in my early 20s, I learned to drive, got a very small sports car, Triumph Spitfire, just a teeny little thing, and started making my way across the country visiting people. I had a friend in Boulder who I came to visit, and I almost couldn't find him, and I was just about to leave town when somebody overheard me asking his name and said, "I know him," and we linked up. And Joan, who was at the time was going by the name Nandi, I met Nandi because she was a friend of this friend of mine, Fred, and so we just met briefly. And I was really on my way to California, but after we gotten to know each other a little bit, and we started a correspondence going, and there I was back out in California, and after a couple of months, I thought it would be pretty cool if I would come back and see her. So I came back in that same little car, and that's when we sort of took up and started our, being an item, you might say, and started living together. This was in August of '69. And then after a while in Colorado, we decided to go back out to California. During that time, the car died, so we had to do the last part as hitchhikers. And and then when September came along and I had to get back to my studies at Columbia, very pleasantly, she was willing to come along with me. So we continued, and we were living in New York City. But I wanted to relocate out of New York City by that time, because New York City was just it seemed too crazy for me, and I wanted a more rural type of setting, a less citified type of setting. So with only my dissertation yet to do in my academics, I got in touch with a lot of different places that had programs having to do with population, which was the interest that I had developed. Wanted to work on population-related sociology. And Cornell gave me a setup that worked for me, so that was the place where we ended up going, and we moved to Ithaca, New York in 1970.
Ithaca, New York.
Yeah. So we moved to Ithaca in 1970 from New York City. And we ended up staying there for 6 years. And it was during that time that I completed my doctoral thesis, and I got my doctorate from Columbia, because I was still enrolled at Columbia, but I was working also at Cornell. And in Ithaca was also when I got together the first group that sort of went someplace, you might say. I'd been in one group in college and graduate school down in New York City that had some really good people in it, but we never made records or anything. We did some performing. That band was by the name of the Orange Mountain Boys, and prior to that I had a little group at Columbia which was called the Morningside Mountain Boys. Back then, if you had a band, a lot of the most famous band were the something or other Mountain Boys, so we were the Morningside Mountain Boys because Columbia's on Morningside Heights in Manhattan. Anyway, those were the two groups that I had, and then in 1970 we ended up in Ithaca, and then I found some good musicians around then, and we started a band called Country Cooking that Nandi and I had. She was the singer, and I was the banjo player. We had some very good musicians, and in the year '71 I got the notion. We had some friends up there who had started a record company, and we were actually putting out vinyl records of bluegrassy sorts of stuff. So I proposed that there be an instrumental record where I and one of the other people in Country Cooking, another banjo player, his name was Tony Trischka. And he was a member of the band, and we played all sorts of different stuff, bluegrass and sort of country music kind of stuff. Anyway, but we had some good banjo arrangements that we had worked on, and I proposed that we make a twin banjo record, and this record company said sure. And we ended up making this record just using two microphones in a quiet room with the instrumentalists who were in this band that we had and a couple of other people from out of town. And this record was called Country Cooking, 14 Bluegrass Instrumentals. And it really did very well. The record label, which we were only the third record they put out, but it was called Rounder Records, which is now one of the bigger independent record labels anywhere, and they've put out thousands of records. But we were the third one they put out. The number on it was 0006. And it did rather well because there wasn't anything quite like that. And we were young progressive musicians playing bluegrass with some of our own creativity on the kind of being demonstrated. And we weren't just there to copy previous styles. We had some of our own ideas. And so the record did well. It became a Book of the Month Club selection, amazingly enough, years down the line. And sold well over 30,000 copies, which is pretty successful for a small label. And it was an important turning point because everybody in that group of instrumentalists was very talented, and this one record gave everybody a chance to start thinking, gee, you mean we're not just bunch of idiots sitting around in Ithaca, New York. There's people around the country and even overseas who like this enough to want to listen to it. And it gave us all the idea that we could maybe have a career in music. And this band didn't go that far as having a career in music, but individually everybody ended up making records with other people, or this band got to make another couple of records. But everybody at some point or another took a shot at a music career, including me. And I was given a large amount of courage on that, because the royalties from this instructional book were as much as I needed to live on. And the same company asked me to do a songbook. So I then put out a Bluegrass songbook where I collected a bunch of famous Bluegrass songs and wrote them out for accessibility to the market. And that book has sold over 100,000 copies. So between the two books, about 1/3 copies have sold, and they continue to be a portion of my income. At that time, there was enough to live on just from the books. So there we were in Ithaca, enjoying living there, but also noticing that we didn't like the climate there at all. On a beautiful day, you couldn't ask for a more beautiful place, but the whole winter was gray, icy, snowy, not much fun for months of the year, and then sometimes it was way too humid and rainy the rest of the year. So coming up on age 30, I remember thinking, if I'm not going to live here the rest of my life, where am I going to live? And we started talking about where else we might live. By this time, we'd gotten married. Joan's originally from Colorado. We met in Colorado. And I thought, well, maybe Colorado would be a good place to move. And so the last year of our band, Country Cooking, 1975, we worked up a tour that included some dates in Colorado, and that was our excuse to go out here. So the summer of 75, we were out in Colorado and took some gigs in the mountains and played the 5th annual Rocky Mountain Bluegrass Festival with our band Country Cooking. And I remember saying to myself, yeah, this is definitely the good place to move to. There's a good music scene happening there. Denver had the Denver Folklore Center, which was a very active hub. They had everything from a music store to music instrument repair shop, concert hall, record store, even bead shop. It was like a hippie shopping center with music as the centerpiece. And there were some very good musicians around here. So it seemed like a community where I could maybe get a career in music launched if I moved here. And Nadi was willing, her family was already here, and so we moved out in February of 76 with the intention of getting a place, something like what we had in Ithaca, which was an old farmhouse, kind of a little, outside of the main part of town. But we decided to move to Denver at first, just to have a home base to kind of explore the state from. So we lived the first 6 months in Denver in an apartment near City Park. And I remember one day looking in the paper in Boulder, just for, rural property, and there's this 2.5 acres near IBM, handyman's dream or something like that, it said. And it's this house, except that it was not the way this house is now. It was the way this house was in 1976, which is, it was a 1910 farmhouse that had been deposited on this property. That there's a 20-acre parcel that was broken into 4 pieces, and the original house is still here, and then 3 additional houses were moved here from town, and they were old, modest farmhouses, and that was our house, built in 1910 and moved here in the 50s.
Where was it moved from?
I don't know exactly, but Longmont is what I remember hearing, and if you drive in the rural areas around, say, Weld County, you'll see a lot of houses that have similar architectural features to that. There's a kind of a hut sort of, it's a single-story thing, and the roof line has a kind of a nice little curve to it. And the old style of siding, and the only thing was that it hadn't had much attention paid to it, and the windows were rotting, and just everything needed replacing. And so they said handyman's dream. The part that I liked was that the price tag on it was $44,000 with 2.5 acres, and it said Left Hand Creek crosses the property. And I thought, before I saw it, I thought this place is going to have to be really, really terrible for me not to want to move here, because we were already living in an old farmhouse, so that didn't scare me at all. And I thought 2.5 acres in Colorado with a creek in the back and beautiful view of the mountains, these tall trees. It was just an idyllic place, and we got $1,000 off on the price, so we bought it for $43,000 back then, and no bank would go in on a loan because it didn't have central heating and it was just not in good shape. The roof was bad, so we ended up having to finance it through the seller, who did not give us a very good rate. So we were paying $309 a month, which seemed really high at the time, but we figured it was worth it. So anyway, we've got our 30-year mortgage for $309 a month, and commenced to live here. And when we got here, the place was totally grown up in weeds, 6-foot weeds everywhere you looked, because the people living here weren't interested in keeping it up. They were on their way out. For history's sake, 3 years previous is when they had bought the property for $24,000, and it just gives people fits to hear how much a property like this could have been bought for back when.
What was the original farm property that this sits
It was
on?
it was a Knaus, the Knaus family, and the Stuart and Josie Poet still live in the house that they were living in there, just to the east of us when we first moved here, and that's the original farmhouse. It's from about 1890, I understand. Mm-hmm. And the chicken coop from that property and the septic is on our part. When they divide up the property, we have some old fence posts and some old stuff that went with the original house, but that's on our property now. Anyway,
well, can we fast forward to
sure.
when you got involved with putting together Hot Rize?
Sure. In 1976 is when I first came out here, and the first thing I wanted to do, as was my practice anywhere I ever went, would be to find other people to play bluegrass music with. And a guy I met at Denver Folklore Center named Charles Sawtell was a very fine guitar player, and he had been in a band previous to that, and we said, wouldn't it be fun to just have an informal group? And we set up this thing where every Tuesday night we played the Denver Folklore Center Concert Hall with a band that we steadfastly refused to give a consistent name to. We would either call it the Rambling Drifters or the Drifting Ramblers or other variants on those names, and the idea was informality ruled. And there was another guy in the band named Warren Kennison, and the three of us were the core of the band, but we'd have different bass players at different times, and different people would join in and play with us. And over the 2 years that we played every Tuesday night at the Folklore Center, we counted up a couple of dozen different musicians would come in and guest with us. And among those musicians were a very talented young guy, Tim O'Brien, who had won the Colorado State Fiddle Championship and was also a very good mandolin player and a very good singer. Although nobody seemed to take any note of his singing being anything special, but I did. I said, this guy's an incredible singer, but he wasn't even given an important singing role in the band that he was in at the time. Another guy was Nick Forster, who later became a guy in Hot Rize, and he was a very versatile guy. Both of those were younger than me and Charles by almost 10 years, but they were some of the best musicians we got to play with. And in the year 1977, I said to myself, it's time to try to launch whatever music career I'm trying to do here, and I need to make a solo record of my own compositions and whatnot. And I had an idea for a variant on bluegrass music that would be a stripped-down version with just 3 instruments, banjo, mandolin, and bass. And I asked Tim O'Brien if he would help me make a demo recording to show to a record company to show the ideas that I'd like to record. So he came up here, and another guy who's in the band that he was in named Dwayne Webster on bass. The three of us started making recordings on a recording machine I had, and we did it right here in the living room. And we actually called it Niwot music because it wasn't exactly bluegrass, because instead of having a full 5-piece bluegrass complement of instruments, we had just banjo, which I was playing through a certain sound effect called a phase shifter, which changed the sound a little bit, and then mandolin and bass, and that was a unique formula. So I decided to call it a new kind of music instead of just saying it's this little invention we have. I said this is called Niwot music because we were doing it in Niwot. And
where were you doing it in Niwot?
right here in this living room. We weren't performing it. We were just making these recordings to impress a record company that there was reason to put out a record of me and my banjo playing. So they said yes. This was a record company in Chicago called Flying Fish Records that had put out one of the country cooking records, and they were willing to put out this record of me and these guys playing this Niwot music. And so that was Tim O'Brien helping me and this other guy Dwayne. And anyway, there's a huge amount of detail I'll just skip over, but I'm getting you the main points of the story, which is, well, along the way, Tim was only 23 in the year 1977. And I was 31 at that time. But he had won this fiddle contest, and both Wyoming and Colorado state champ fiddle player. And there was a Colorado label that asked him to make a record of fiddle stuff and some of his singing. And he asked me to be on that. And then Charles, the guy from the Rambling Drifters, was also a part of both records. So when the records were recorded and getting ready to come out, at this point Tim had moved to Minnesota to get married to a girl he met here who was from Minnesota, and now he was living in Minnesota. But I called him up and said, why don't you come back here and we'll start a group and we'll promote our 2 records that we're on with Charles. And so Tim thought about it and decided to come back, and we'd start the group. So that's what happened. In 1978, January, we finally got everybody in one place. There was a 4th guy, a very splendid guitar player named Mike Scapp, who was sort of, an unusual personality that didn't mesh well in groups, unfortunately. And even though he was a great guitar player, he never lasted very long in any band he was in, and he didn't last long in our band. And when he quit, we replaced him with Nick Forster, the guy I mentioned, we had known from the Folklore Center. So we had me and Tim, Charles on guitar, and then Nick became our bass player. That was the 4-person group. And that group stayed together for 12 years and has a pretty important chapter in bluegrass history, I'm proud to say, Hot Rize.
Would you point out the members of your
That's
group?
me, that's Tim, that's Nick, and that's Charles. And this picture was taken about 10 years after we started the band. But when we started the band, we had a lot of musical talent, but other than me and Charles, not much music business experience. Both Nick and Tim were like around 23 at the time. And while they were very good musicians, we were all pretty green in terms of knowing what to do as trying to make a living in the music business. I had been on a few records, and I was kind of self-supported by this record, by my instructional books and stuff. But we all were very intent on seeing if we could make something big happen with this band, and we bought a traveling car. We had a 1969 Cadillac. We got a U-Haul trailer, an old U-Haul trailer that Charles painted to match the two-tone black and white Cadillac, and we had a very fancy-looking traveling rig with this big old boat of a car, and then the trailer behind carrying our sound system. And I knew how to get gigs. I knew how to get on the phone and get people interested in hiring us. So at first I tried to have somebody working for us as an agent, but I knew I'd do a better job, and I ended up being the agent for the band, and I spent part of every day making phone calls and trying to find us work. Part of the idea was that if I could just keep us working every single week, then nobody in the band would be tempted to work with any other band. And Tim, because of his multiple skills, was often asked to do stuff, but my strategy was to keep him too busy to do anything with anybody else, and I succeeded. And we even, by the end of the year, thanks to some old contacts that I had, we were able to play some festivals back east. And we got invited to some, various regional events around Colorado. We got to play quite a few. The main places that you had to play then, if you were a bluegrass band, was some place where they had music. Maybe they had folk music or rock music or something, but these music clubs. There's a picture of us a few years into our career playing in Kentucky at a major festival down there. But a lot of the places we played around here were bars, basically, where you'd play from 9 to 1, and a lot of people liked our band, and we get good crowds, but our crowd was not what you call a drinking crowd. And so the club owners liked to see all these people coming to see us, but they weren't buying much alcohol, and we would end up losing our job there, even though we could draw a lot of people. And we pretty much exhausted all the places like that in Colorado, or at least in our part of Colorado. Back then, people wouldn't dance, at least around here. They wouldn't get up and dance to bluegrass music. Now, what you've got there is that's our alter ego band that came along quite some time later. That's when we would change out of the suits that were our part of our bluegrass garb and change our outfits and play a different kind of music from bluegrass using different instruments, electric instruments, sort of patterned after the music that Hank Williams and Bob Wills would make around the year 1950 or so. And we had that kind of music as part of what we did. Are we on a pause for recording now? Oh. We did that kind of music from the beginning, but we got the notion to sort of dress up and add some comedic elements to it as time went on. And so there'd be a time in every show where we would leave the stage and relinquish it to this other band called Red Knuckles and the Trailblazers. And then people were in store for a different kind of music, although still a country kind of music. And then there were these comedic elements to it. So the combination of the two bands as part of the show, Hot Rize and Red Knuckles, made a pretty powerful entertainment package. And we did our experimenting with that locally. And in fact, I guess I was mentioning, we had exhausted all the bars. They weren't hiring us because we couldn't get people up and dancing. If they would dance, they would drink. But we couldn't get them dancing. They would just sit there and listen to us. So we were not a good fit for those, but then Nandi suggested that we use the Grange Hall here in Niwot and just play there and just have concerts there and not worry about having to sell alcohol or anything. So we tried that, and it didn't take off right away, but eventually it did take off, and we could fill the Grange Hall 2 nights on a weekend or even 3 pretty regularly. And there was not an issue of alcohol because we weren't allowed to have alcohol in the Grange anyway. But we could actually make pretty good money just charging admission here. And so the Grange Hall in Niwot became our home base. Anytime we were knew we were going to be around town, we would maybe have 2 weekends in a row playing at the Grange Hall.
Where are some of the places you went that are particularly interesting for concerts?
You mean outside the state?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 1980, we got asked to do a European tour, just on the strength of the first record we'd made. The guy didn't know anything about us except he heard this record, and he wanted to bring us to Europe, so we got to play in France and Holland and Sweden and Denmark when the band had only been together for 2 years, 1980. So that was really fun, a very special thing for us to have a chance to go travel abroad and be able to come back to Colorado as people who had been asked to play in Europe. That made us special among Colorado musicians. We played at an important bluegrass festival called Indian Springs in Maryland in the first September of the band in 1978, and there's a major national bluegrass magazine called Bluegrass Unlimited that thought of us as a bright new light on the scene and put us on the cover of their magazine the very first year of the band. That gave us a nice boost. When the record finally came out, which was 2 years or so from when we first put out our first band record, I mean, when we first put together the band, the first record didn't come out till 2 years later, but when it came out, it got great reviews all over the place, and we were able to kind of advertise ourselves as an important new part of the bluegrass scene. A lot of it had to do with Tim's great singing. He's just a tremendous singer, and he had not been recognized at all as a singer before, but now he was front and center as a great lead singer. And then he also, at my suggestion, I said, well, we need to start writing songs that'll be our band's songs. And he hadn't tried writing songs before, but he became a very good songwriter real fast, and we had some songs that are now classics in bluegrass that Tim wrote.
Could you play just a brief?
One of them, the first one, the second song he ever wrote, I think, is one called Nellie Cain. And now this is not my key to singing it, but I'll kind of give you an idea. As a young man I went riding out on the western plains in the hills of North Dakota. I met my Nellie Cain, I met my Nellie Cain. She was living in a lonely cabin with a son by another man. 5 years she had waited for him, as long as a woman can, as long as a woman can. I don't know what changed my mind, till then I was a rambling kind of love I can't explain that I have for Nellie Cain. And still when we play together, that song might come up, and that was written in the very first year of Hot Rize.
How long did Hot Rize stay together?
Well, 12 years from the time Nick joined the band. He joined the band on May 1st, 1978, and on April 30th, 1990 was our last gig when we had completed 12 years. And by this time we went out, you know, kind of at the top. We had, that year we won Entertainer of the Year, which is the top award given to a bluegrass band. And we also, we put out a record, and that got a Grammy nomination when the Bluegrass Grammy was only a new thing on the scene. And that the end of the band happened because Tim, who was doing so well as a singer and songwriter as part of our band, a couple of the songs that we had done got picked up on by a well-known country music singer named Kathy Mattea, and one of them went to number 2, and the other one was in the top 10 for a long time of the country charts, and it helped get Tim some recognition in Nashville. And he was asked, he was interested in seeing maybe if he could become some kind of a country star singer. And there were people who said, yes, we think we can make that happen. So he signed a deal with RCA Records, which didn't work out very well for him. The tides of the music business changed pretty fast, and he was considered a little too folky or something, and not real star material for country music, despite his amazing talents. And but in the meantime, with that happening, he gave notice to the band that he would stay with the band one more year, and that the band finally ended in 1990. Tim's career as a major country star never got to happen, but he's over the years developed a huge amount of respect as a sort of a folk artist. Very eclectic. He's made Irish music records and lots of different things, and his great singing ability and his wonderful songwriting ability has taken him far. He's written some songs that have earned him some really good pay. He's written, one of the songs was on a Garth Brooks record, so you get lots of money for that. So he's had a great career, and the limitation on Hot Rize, Hot Rize disbanded. In fact, Nick, who had been part of Hot Rize, joined Tim's band when Tim started his new band.
And what's happened to Nick now?
Well, Nick has gone on to a lot of things. He stayed with Tim for a year or two, but it was around that time he also got the notion to start a radio program. That would be a special radio program, and he and his wife, who who has an acting background. The two of them combined forces to start this radio show called E-Town. And that started, I believe, in the year 1991 in Boulder, and they have built it into this, it's still going today. It's very successful. It's on over 200 radio stations. Nick is not only the main MC, but he also plays a variety of instruments with the musical guests. And so he's really fashioned a major career for himself as a radio host and versatile musician. But after Hot Rize disbanded, we were, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we were a beloved group, because we had some songs that really touched people's hearts, and we also could get people pretty hysterical during the show, laughing at the antics of Red Knuckles and the Trailblazers. And we had a very complete entertainment package, you might say. Had a lot of virtuoso playing, a lot of creativity. We had a unique sound as a bluegrass band, and very respected by people who wanted to hear hardcore bluegrass, not the modernized version, but we could play sort of modern style bluegrass as well as very respectful hardcore traditional based bluegrass music. And so pretty much everybody liked Hot Rize. We gave them a lot of reasons to like us, and when we disbanded, we were one of the best paid bands in the business, and a lot of people took it hard that we would choose to quit. And we didn't part on bad terms. Everybody was willing to play together, but Tim had this job to do. At a certain point, within a couple of years, people were saying, "Gee, do you think you guys get together for a reunion? We'll pay a really good money if you'll just play together again." So we started playing reunion shows, and we were playing maybe a half dozen a year throughout the 90s. And we even, in one year, 96, we chose to do about 20 gigs altogether. We did a tour, and on the last couple of days of the tour, we played at the Boulder Theater, and Nick arranged, without our knowing it, to have it all recorded. And a record came out of that, which I think is far and away our best record, because we were a very good stage band, and this captured what we sounded like when we weren't self-conscious about being in a recording studio. All of our records, when you're in a recording studio and you don't have a crowd there, you don't get in the same mood that you're in when you're on stage. And when we were in that good stage mood, we could deliver well. And in fact, our best-selling stuff is our live stuff, actually. So we put out a record based on 1996 recordings. By something about 1994 or so, Charles found out he had leukemia, and it didn't debilitate him very much at all at first, but it was understood that it would kill him if he didn't maybe have a bone marrow transplant. So he undertook a bone marrow transplant, I believe, in 1997, and it actually succeeded in eradicating the leukemia, but it also weakened him so badly that he succumbed, and he died to from a lung infection in 1999. And that was now 21 years from when the four of us first became a band, and there had never been anybody else called Hot Rize for 21 years. And as a reunion band, we were, again, one of the top paid bands and very successful, but only playing a few times a year. Once Charles died, we didn't know really what to do about Hot Rize. Couldn't imagine doing anything without Charles. But when this record came out, which took a long time to happen, it's a long story, but it took 6 years before that record, made in 96, came out, and came out in 02. And with the release of that record, with Charles on it, and a great retrospective of our band, we decided to play some gigs. And we got somebody else to play guitar, a guy named Brian Sutton, who's pretty much the top bluegrass guitar player, wins Guitar Player of the Year pretty much regularly these days. Great guitar player, and he filled in very well for Charles. Anyway, since 2002, we've had the same three, me and Nick and Tim, and now with Brian Sutton as the fourth member of the band. And we played not as many as probably 8 shows in one year, and sometimes there's only 2 shows per year, mainly because Tim doesn't have time to do a lot of other stuff. He has a lot of other fish to fry, but he likes doing Hot Rize. And it's still a very popular thing when we do it. And so all the way from 2002 to this year, 2007, we've always played a number of gigs as Hot Rize with Brian on guitar. And that's looking to continue. We have, in '08, we have 1 gig so far scheduled. I don't know how many there'll be, but Hot Rize is sort of, kind of living a very limited occasional existence. But when we hit the stage, people usually tell us, geez, it doesn't sound like you ever stopped, because we fit together so well. We have 30 years of musical history together, the 3 of us. You asked before about the name Hot Rize. When the band hadn't even yet assembled, I remembered that it's hard to figure out a name for a band. So I would always carry this little pad with me. My dad had suggested that long ago. He says, writers always have something to write on. Anytime they have an idea, they'll write down the idea. So I carried with me a pad, and one day driving into Denver, I remember thinking, Hot Rize, that's the secret ingredient of Martha White flour. And there's a famous jingle that Flatt and Scruggs used to sing. That was their sponsor. So they'd say, Martha White self-rising flour's got Hot Rize. And it's this cute little song that they did. And I thought, Hot Rize, that would be a good name for a band. And I wrote it down. And this is when there wasn't any band to name it from, but it was just an idea. And I kept creative ideas in a file, and I remember, I have some band names, so I looked it up, and there's Hot Rize sitting there, and let's see if the guys in the band would be okay with that. They all said fine. But it was owned by the Martha White Flour Company, so I had to get in touch with them to make sure, to see what they thought about our using the name, and they actually right away said it would be fine, except one stipulation: you have to keep the show clean, which was not an issue. So we said, sure, we'll keep the show clean. And they said, well, then you can use the name. And when we got to play on the 3 years later, when the band was really interested in some big exposure, we got to play the Grand Ole Opry because they helped arrange that to happen. They let us use the design of their flower packages as a T-shirt, and we sold thousands and thousands of those T-shirts, and still do. And they never made us pay them anything for the use of that. And they would occasionally, in fact, they'd even buy 20 shirts at a time from us and pay us full price for the shirts. And of course, they were happy to be getting their name out all over the place. And it's still a popular brand of flour that has a leavening ingredient in it that is sort of altitude dependent, and it doesn't work in Colorado. So here we are really making them famous in Colorado, where they can't even sell the product, but it still sells real well elsewhere.
You, over the years, you have met with Steve Martin. How did you ever make that
actually not that much over the years. I just happened to be reading in Banjo Newsletter magazine, and they had an interview with him, and the interviewer asked him who were some of his favorite players, and he started talking about, he didn't remember my name, but he says, he says, are you familiar with Hot Rize? He says, the interviewer says, yeah. He says, the guy who plays with him, I just love his playing, He went on and on about me. So I was pretty happy to hear that, because Steve is a very good banjo player, and of course he's famous for playing the banjo, among other things. So getting in touch with him was quite a job. Just getting in touch with him through his agency didn't really seem to work. But I have a mutual friend, a guy that I knew was old friends with Steve, and I ran into him and I said, how do I get a message to Steve Martin? He says, email it to me, and then I'll forward it to Steve, and if he wants, he'll answer you. So Steve got back in touch with me. And I said, well, I get to New York sometimes, that's where I'm from. And, would you like to get together? And he said, oh, I'd love to get together. We have a little party or something, and have a music party. So at next opportunity, that's what happened. And just, went to his fancy place on Central Park West. And I'm going to meet a famous guy. And he was at least as nervous as I was, strangely enough. And I found that he's a very humble and somewhat shy person, as well as being a very talented person. And I came to realize that he holds musicians in really very high esteem. And he was, like I said, about as stoked to meet me as I was to meet him. And
We've got 2 minutes.
yeah. Oh, and then we're done? Done? Okay. Well, anyway, we had a good time at that party. I became aware of some things in his playing that he'd probably like to improve, and I suggested I could help him improve with that, and he was very open to that. So last summer, the summer of '06, I went out to his house and spent a few days with him working on his playing. And I guess something to include is this thing that happened in '05 when we got to be on the David Letterman show together. This was just an idea he had, not to be on Letterman, but there's a festival. He has a connection with the New Yorker magazine, and they have a festival called the New Yorker Festival, and they invited him to have a program featuring banjo players. Or maybe he had the idea, but anyway, he decided to get together himself and a few other players, and he included me and Earl Scruggs and 2 other people, and we put on a show at the New Yorker Festival, and the Letterman performance came about as a result of that. And so we got to be on TV September '05 playing Foggy Mountain Breakdown right there with Earl Scruggs, and it was a big highlight for me.
Thank you, Pete. I really appreciate your taking the time. This has been fascinating. You have had an interesting career. And I know it's still going.
It is.